Quiero
From the outset, I will try to speak Spanish, but I ask for your indulgence because my Spanish is not my mother tongue, and it's not my working language either. So I may have some difficulty in using certain terms, and for all of this, I ask for your indulgence. I will speak Spanish because this is a better way, to make myself understood. And I guess there are only three or four Portuguese-speaking persons here, so I must apologize to my colleagues from Angola for this. But I hope. But before I begin, let me say a word of thanks to the Cuban Prosecutor General's office for its invitation, and I have all and I have been asked by the Prosecutor General from Portugal to speak here, and he was here a couple of years ago, as a matter of fact, and he is sending greetings to his Cuban counterpart. And I want to thank the organizers, for the excellent arrangements and the warm welcome that we have been given since our arrival. And this is this interim suspension of criminal procedures is a tool that exists in other countries too. And in recent years, this tool has evolved significantly, as compared to 10 years ago. This tool has been quite facilitating in the exercise, and we have a principle of legality in Portugal that is that uh, in any case of crime there must be a due process of law, and unlike in other systems, like in most, and unlike the Anglo-Saxon system, we don't have, the principle of opportunity. Our resources are limited, and we have prosecuting and limited prosecuting resources, and so the prosecutor has to pursue every crime, and a lot of reference has been made here to corruption and highly organized crime, and so we need to have assets to conduct investigations, criminal investigations that are indeed difficult and which cannot be pursued by a single prosecutor. In fact, in Portugal, we don't use the term prosecutor. We use the the term public ministry. So during these complex investigations, these complex investigations involve not only one, not just a prosecutor, but a team of prosecutors. And on many occasions, these prosecutors are coming from different jurisdictions. A complex investigation these days, that is, for example, an economic or financial probe, will require prosecutors who are specialized in civil, administrative, and financial laws. And in Portugal, the prosecutor's office it has branches in every jurisdiction in the country, and that is, we have branches that deal with labor issues, civil issues, and family issues, and of course we also have a constitutional court as well as a Supreme Court, and we rely heavily on the principle of proportionality. So we need to address the most important issues with the most important assets available, and but we cannot address, the low, medium level of crimes, but their treatment is has a lower priority than so low and medium offenses are treated using the suspension of a two process, and which that is before going to trial, and no, this interim suspension is applied to the accused of crimes that are liable to imprisonment of up to 5 years, or as well as individuals who had not prior criminal history, as well as and the suspension is determined on recommendation by the prosecution, or on recommendation by the defendant or the victim. And of course, it requires also consensus. It requires also the consent, agreement or approval by the defendant as well as the victim. That is also, well, a part of a process in the case so that we have a victim in the case, and this tool has evolved dramatically, like I said, in Portugal over the last few years. Even if this tool has existed since 1987, that is over 30 years ago, in the initial years it was hardly used. And in 2010, that is about 6 or 7 years ago, only 10% of the cases that merit merited this tool, and this tool was actually applied. At present, 35% of the total cases in which the prosecution exercises is calling for a criminal action, that is that the investigation has unveiled all of the transgressions as well as the perpetrator, and in 35% of these cases, this tool is implemented. I have a chart showing that over the last 3 years, we have applied this tool to in the 34 to between 34 and 37,000 cases. That is, the suspension that has been put in place prior to the hearing. And this is very important because in 2 years, that is, between 2016 and 2017, in which we have had around 100,000 cases in which the prosecution has called for criminal for imprisonment, and this imprisonment has been replaced by this tool, and around 63% of all the cases, the defendants have been charged to go to trial. So more than 1/3 of all of the criminal action cases do not go to trial. And this is good not only for the prosecution but also for the entire court system, because we will not, because we will see trials only in one third of all the total cases. Of course, these are the cases in which compelling evidence is available to take a defendant to trial. Now, there are five types of offenses in which this suspension has been implemented. That is, when the judge calls for a 5-year term of imprisonment. And the next one is when the offenses while driving. That is, offenses related to traffic accidents and that is, and the offenses pertaining to civil disobedience and then the domestic violence and drug use. But there are many other cases. But these five categories have seen the highest implementation of this tool. Here we see the terms and conditions in which this tool has been implemented. And in these cases, the defendant is subject to certain terms and conditions. And these terms and conditions, notice of these terms and conditions are given to the state. And for example, there's a ban on driving a vehicle, and another one is to attend certain programs for rehabilitation, and in the case that there are victims, so there is also compensation payable to the victims. And over the past 3 years, we've seen these victim compensation and in the amount of in close to 3,000 cases, and the values are shown on the screen. The values of the compensation are shown on the screen. Hmm. Yeah, here are all the values. The values have been also computed. And in the close to 30,000 cases every year. Oh, now, what happens? And what happens with these cases that see suspension in around 35,000 cases a year? And because it's not enough to see observance, but because there may be a need, to go to trial because another crime has been perpetrated, in the interim period. That is in 2014, 15, and 16, and there's been the only 14% of these cases of suspension have actually go to trial. So, 70, 78 and 78% of the cases have been processes have been activated without the need to go to trial, have been settled, without the need to go to trial, and this represents, cost savings. And this is the same chart. Next. Here you have the offenses in which this interim suspension has been applied, and beside the categories of offenses, and these are the priority categories. In Portugal, and there is a law that that attaches, rankings, to offenses, and certain crimes, certain offenses, given more priority of treatment. So within the crimes and within the offenses that have been that have ranked high and unarmed for the prosecution, and in which this tool has been applied is that is offenses against sexual free determination and domestic violence and human trafficking and corruption and money laundering and tax evasion and cyber crimes. So, so these are the crimes that that are given priority, and these are crimes that are not low or medium level offenses. And very quickly, let us look at the consensus solutions, for the small and medium crimes. And this this suspension is applicable on recommendation by the prosecution's office. This is an initiative by the participating victim in case as a victim. And in fact, originally the law established that the prosecution could suspend the procedure, but no, the law has been amended recently, and now the prosecution has the duty that right after allegations have been made, and the prosecution has a duty by law, to choose these tool, when the allegations have been confirmed. And now the offenses that are punishable with 5 years of imprisonment. This is all. It is also applicable. The tool is also applicable to offenses that are punishable with imprisonment for more than 5 years. Although the prosecution may feel that the imprisonment term should be lower than that, and also in the cases in which these offenses have been perpetrated by defendants who do not have a prior history of crimes of the same nature, or who have not benefited before from a suspension, an interim suspension. In the past, the law established that if you had perpetrated an offense before, and if you had been the subject of suspension before, this will not apply. And but at present, the implementation has not been. The implementation will not be valid if a person has perpetrated a crime of the same nature before. When the prosecutor and the prosecutor has the different avenues to confirm the perpetration of a crime, or that is the prosecuting office has a database as well as in which it records all of the cases of sent to suspension, and then so the prosecutor will always rely on its database, and then searches are also conducted in the National Register in order to investigate the history of the defendant. Also, approval by the defendant is required, and then in the event that a victim has been identified, approval from the victim is also required. So the solution has to be a consensus one, and if there's no consensus, then this tool cannot be applied. Now, the resolution on this suspension must be made in writing. There's no need for a hearing, but there must be contact between the prosecutor and the participating individual. So this is the defendant and if applicable the victim, so that the victim will know, and the victim will freely give his or her approval, and of course there's need for the judge also to extend its approval. There has been a lot of controversy around this, because originally the law did not contemplate judges' approval, but now the judge's approval can be obtained by the prosecutor. So these terms and conditions, as recommended by the prosecutor and approved by the defendant, need also approval from the court, because in the past the court was not intervening, and because in the past it was the prosecutor and recommendation with approval by the defendant, but it did. Now the judge's acquiescence is required. So once approval has been obtained for the suspension, and then the prosecutor goes to the judge and request and seek audience from the judge, and then the judge may agree or disagree. But the constitutional court said that the judge's opinion is just a formality in this case. But of course, the terms and conditions cannot be amended by the judge. The only thing the judge can do is to claim that the condition that there's no guarantee, or that the case does not warrant the suspension. But the fact is that the judge can always say no. So in that case, the case will have to be taken to court to trial. Now, this tool can be applied in the case of a recognition of guilt, a high recognition of guilt, and and the rules of conduct are sufficiently consistent with the requirements for prevention. This is why we have the certain concepts here for implementation, and that is prosecution needs to understand that there is a high recognition of guilt, and in that case, and of course, the prosecution has to determine whether the offense is a minor or a medium. And the 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 application of the suspension must be warranted, and it must be a sufficient response to a crime that was originally perpetrated. Now, the suspension is for a specific term, which that is 2 years, except for two cases, domestic violence and the crimes against sex-free determination, which case its maximum term is 5 years. So there is no minimum term. And during this period, the crime does not prescribe. During this period, certain terms and conditions are imposed. In regards to rules of conduct that must be observed by the perpetrator. There is a list of rules. That is, one of the requirements are, like victim compensation and victim reparation, and that is, well, and place a specific place of residence, and refraining from attendance of a certain. Of course, the suspension must be adequate and proportionate and sufficient. And of course, the dignity of the individual cannot be offended, and the judge will take into account the observance of these conditions before he gives his approval of suspension. So the judges we're talking about is the judge, is the investigative judge. It's not the trial judge. Because if the case goes to trial, it is not this investigative judge, but rather a different judge who will preside over, the uh, the court that will hear the case. And and if the if the rules of conduct have been observed, and if the perpetrator has not perpetrated a similar offense, so then the perpetrator goes free, or but if otherwise, the case goes to trial. And there will be a minimal failure to comply, which is immaterial. So there may be a material failure to comply. And even so, the prosecution believes that the suspension applies, but with amended terms and conditions. But in that case, he will also need to seek a judge's approval. But if the failure to comply has been gross or negligent, and the terms of the suspension have been violated, then the case will go to trial. And the same applies if the perpetrator commits an offense of the same nature during the period of suspension. Finally, offenses with specific subject to specific regimes. That is domestic violence and or simple or rather than the aggravated domestic violence cases, which cannot be subject to suspension. And the feature here is that the suspension is on recommendation by the victim rather than the prosecutor. Although the prosecution has to confirm if the victim has made her recommendation on free will. Now, the second case is sex offenses, which is simple sex offenses rather than aggravated sex offenses. And in this case, the recommendation comes from the prosecutor, but with regard paid to the victim's interests. And crimes of active corruption and offenses of active corruption that and in this case. In this case, the suspension applies to the perpetrator who has made a significant contribution to clarify the case or has actively or clearly recognized his guilt, and of course it requires also the judge's approval. And larcenies, for example, the the larceny may occur in a shop, that is, for example, a shoplifting, and with immediate recovery of the asset that's been stolen, and unless the shoplifting has involved two co-defendants. This is very quickly the areas in which this tool applies. Of course, this is not something that is particularly new, but it's just a way in which we are operating our legal and court systems, for addressing complicated cases. This is all. Thank you very much.